Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. Welcome to this Product People community event. Today we will have a session by Jenny Herald. She will introduce herself and tell a bit more about her. The session is about OKRs and strengthening your strategic thinking. So very much looking forward to that. Before we start, I will just do a brief introduction of Product People and about myself, and we'll get going to the juicy part in a bit. And before we get there, just to let everyone know that we are also streaming this on multiple platforms. So if you have other people that would enjoy this session, other product enthusiasts, feel free to share the link so that they will join us. So just a little bit about me. I'm relatively new to the product management field. Been here for a little more than 2 years, mostly in a startup environment. And yeah, even though I had an aerospace engineering background, never really became an engineer by profession, and decided that startups and this messy, chaotic world of product management was more my thing. So yeah, then I joined Product People as an APM2, and yeah, enjoying a lot and growing a lot as a product manager. So what we do at Product People, basically we are a product management consulting company. We help companies discover and deliver great products faster. We do that through our hands-on product management work at our clients, either as interim product managers, or you can also be with more specific missions on setting up the product function or improving a specific feature, launching a new market, for example. So we have very different types of engagements in the clients, but it's always in a fractional or interim basis, so 3 to 12 months typically. We onboard fast, align teams, and deliver outcomes. And that's the way we make money, but we also have this other part of the community. We have more than 20,000 product management enthusiasts in our community. Actually, on LinkedIn, it's now more than 21,000. And yeah, we do this sharing of knowledge from our experiences. We also bring super interesting guests and speakers like Jenny to talk about product-related topics. And that's about what we do. Another interesting thing to mention, news update, is that we launched today a podcast. So you can check that out on your favorite podcast app if you're into podcasts, Product People Podcast. This first season will be a compilation of previous online events that we had. So we take the juiciest part of these sessions that we're having and compile them into a 30 minutes podcast so that you can consume it in a faster, more efficient way, and also get the most out of it. Also I know Jenny also has a podcast, so if you're into podcasts, that might also be interesting to check it out. It's called Dreams with Deadlines, right, Jenny?
That's right.
Yeah. So if you're into podcasts, you have here 2 super cool suggestions to follow and to learn more about product and this world of creating great products. All right. So I will now give the stage to Jenny. She will make a presentation on the topic that I've just described. And after that, we will have the time to take questions. So if you have any questions, just drop them on the chat, and we'll take them after the session. One thing before we get to the present, there's these questions that I like you to answer. So if you're on Zoom, you will see a pop-up with the question that you can ask. If you're on the other platforms, please answer in the chat in the chat, whether you're on LinkedIn or YouTube, just drop your answer there. So the first one is, do you use OKRs framework in your company? And the second one, has your product team's performance increased since you started using OKRs? And I will take a few more seconds for you to answer and leave your reply. And yeah, I think we already have here some answers. Yeah, some people are saying that most of the answers is that they use OKRs already. Regarding the second question, how has your product team's performance increased since you started using OKRs? It's more or less a 50-50 split. Some people have, some people have not. So yeah, interesting to see that not everyone has seen results. So maybe Jenny will share some interesting insights on how to make them more effective and have a better impact. All right, that being said, I will not take more time. I will not, sorry. I will not take more time, and I will pass over the word to Jenny. So Jenny, thank you so much for being here, and you can share your screen now.
All right. Thumbs up. We can see it. Cool. All right. So if you are joining me today, then you know that we're talking about how to sharpen your strategic thinking skills using OKRs. Maybe I can start with I started working at a to-do list app called Wunderlist, which got acquired by Microsoft. And then I worked for a startup, which unfortunately died because we ran out of money. And now I work at Quantive, which is really exciting. So my role is VP of Product Evangelism at Quantive. And what I do is I champion our vision, which is to help customers achieve better business outcomes using our solution based on the objectives and key results methodology, which is why I'm talking about that. I'm also the host of Dreams with Deadlines, which graciously you all mentioned already. We're scaling the business, which is really exciting. Prior to that, I had a kind of interesting life where I worked on like destroyer class ships, intercontinental ballistic missiles, satellite programs, recapitalizing entire air fleets, and avionics boxes and stuff. It was pretty interesting. So I've had quite a shift in my career, but it's always been around how to solve someone's problem to get something done. So if we were to think about strategic thinking, I think it really is a combination of two things. It's about being proactive and it's acting with intention. You're like, okay, Jenny, that's very vague. What does that actually mean? When someone says that, you aren't thinking strategically enough, I think there are two challenges to that. The first is that you actually might not be a strategic thinker. In fact, you're probably more tactical in nature. So you're good at keeping things going, right? The other could be that you are actually strategic. Like you are a change maker. You are trying to make progress against a vision, but nobody knows. And in one of the two camps, you either need to figure out how you're going to develop or how you're going to demonstrate those skills. If you're trying to develop them, then you need to work in strategic roles or gather experiences where you're able to identify patterns, connect the dots in novel ways, right? If the challenge is that you aren't able to demonstrate it, then you kind of have to be a mixture of things, a marketer, salesperson, a change maker, people who get up and say, you know what, I challenge that thought, where you actually come up with a strategic idea and then you drive that ahead and people can actually see the results of that effort. So when someone says, I don't think you're thinking strategically enough, I think it's worthwhile to think about, is it that I need to develop these skills or do I need to demonstrate those skills? And so we're going to talk about what it actually means in terms of the research, right? So can strategic thinking be taught? Yes. This is a model for how to think about the components that go into strategic thinking. The first is that you have a systems perspective, right? You're looking at the system as a whole. You're thinking about how each of those requisite parts are influencing each other. You also are intent focused, right? You have some sense of direction and you're reshaping that intent. You're not only just thinking about the future, you're thinking about the gap between what is now and what could be. You're hypothesis driven. Does this sound like a product manager? You're asking the question, well, what if? And then you're answering it with, well, if that, then what? And then you're, opportunistic, right? You're taking advantage of strategies that might be emerging, putting that into action in a changing environment. We do this all the time. Frederick Taylor back in the day was coined for saying, well, there are those who think and those who do. And so there became kind of this separation where there's management, and those are the people who think, and then there's people who actually do the stuff at the factory floor. Those are those who do. I think in modern environments like ours, like everyone is thinking and everyone is doing. At a strategic, let's say, leadership team level, what they're thinking about is, how strong are our operating margins, and how are we going to build durable long-term advantages? If you think about the current environment with all of these quote unquote economic headwinds that we're faced with, the challenge is trying to figure out how we can improve our strategic position as well as our financial position. A lot of businesses right now, I would suggest, are either playing defense or going big or going home. They're paring back on things that are not core businesses or things that are not developing the margins that they want. And so a lot of businesses are tending to be conservative. And unfortunate for that, that's especially in tech, we're seeing a bunch of layoffs, in particular because low margin or weak revenue streams are getting trimmed. So why does this matter to us? We need to be building products that have high margins and strong revenue streams, right? So I would argue that it is all of our responsibility to understand the destination of where we need to go, our mission, vision, value set. We need to be understanding of what KPIs or targets the business needs to hit. Like, what do we need to do to continue to run the business in a way that actually produces the outcomes we want? But we also want to change the business, right? What needs to change? How do we move together so that we get aligned? What kind of impacts are we going to make corporately so that those things become core to the business? And then all of the work that we need to do, the tasks, our projects, our epics, how are we aligning all of that to either keeping the lights on or changing the business? And so when you talk to a senior leader, and I actually have shared this, like these few slides with a few kind of CIOs, CFO, COOs, like the C level of businesses, and they shake their heads and say, yes, if we want to exist as a business, we need to develop value and deliver that value. And stakeholder value, which is what I will use in this example, as opposed to, let's say, shareholder value, is like, we need to grow our revenue streams. We need to improve our operating margins. We just talked about how that's important today, especially with kind of the recession that's looming. We need to make sure that we're making efficient use of our assets, and we need to make sure that we're meeting our expectations, right? And there are different ways to drive that stakeholder value. If you'll notice, these are the areas that product people would probably fit into. We need to innovate our product services. We need to focus on our customer retention. We need to cross-sell. We need to improve our pricing, develop greater efficiencies, be more agile in our practices, improve our culture, invest in our people, maybe even invest in ESG type of stuff. That's cool. But all of that's going to be common in the business. And you'll see how that maps in a second. If we were to think about what is unique to every business, it is, what is the thing that you're doing as a business that you believe is the future? Like, we exist so that this can exist, right? In the case of Lemonade Inc., they really wanted to disrupt insurance. They wanted to make it more delightful, affordable, precise, and socially impactful. And if I were to kind of take that as an example and think about, well, what kind of OKRs would they set? Well, they say, what if we can process a claim? Because we know it takes forever. If you were to say, there was an incident, please give me my money. Through AI and a bunch of things that they've invested in, they can process a claim, reduce fraudulent charges, and it be done and hit your bank account in less than 5 seconds. Like, that's insane to me. Let's say that you gave them money and some of those funds are unused. They, as part of their business model, will donate those to a nonprofit of your choice. And they're doing this in a means that all of us are familiar with. They're doing it in like a mobile, app. And so they want to make sure that they're delighting customers in that way. Now, there's a bunch of strategic initiatives that are tied to reaching those overall objectives and key results that are in service of making insurance in a different way. And so the OKRs part, let's talk about that for the folks who are not familiar with what this means. Like, the objective is, here's my goal. Here is what we need to achieve, why it's important, some desired future state. We talked about that in the beginning of strategic thinking, like what is that future state? Where are we today? How are we going to close that gap? And then the key results are measures that tell us whether we're successful in achieving that objective. They're quantitative in nature, they're measurable, they're very much focused on outcomes. And John Doerr's formula, if you've read the book, Measure What Matters, he presents it this way. We're going to achieve this thing as measured by this set of measures or key results. If we push all of this together, then that which is common to every business, developing that stakeholder value you see here, but then what is unique to the business and our place in it is the strategy tree on the left. What connects this is that we're doing a bunch of stuff that either keeps the lights on and helps us do those things and helps us do those things in a way that's unique to our business. Now, when then businesses think about, well, what are we going to invest in? Where do we need to hire? What they're saying is we need to figure out how we're going to drive that stakeholder and strategic value at the same time. So if we were to think about the business capabilities that they're going to invest in, and maybe further along, like the IT capabilities that they want to develop, all of these people and resources are a service of doing what it is necessary for the business and what is necessary in achieving the strategic aims of that business. If we climb down, let's say, one branch of that, we took the insurance example, right? We want to make insurance more delightful, affordable, precise, socially impactful. What if their objective is to expand internationally? Amazing. Well, then we need a bunch of initiatives that will localize experiences for each of the geographies as part of that international expansion idea. We're going to have measures, those would be key results. And they're going to invest in people so that they can improve responsiveness in those geos, so that, let's say, an IT team or a set of IT teams are able to take that data, they can efficiently obtain it, analyze it, process it, and pay the claims that are made. These are just one way to think about just writing down one or climbing down one of the branches. So you're going to ask me, well, Jenny, where do we fit in? How does product fit in to all of that? I really like John Cutler's approach to this, where he talks about the data-informed product cycle, where you start with the strategy, which is an answer to some questions about choices that you're going to make. What is our winning aspiration? Where are we going to play? Who will we do that with? What capabilities do we need to have in order to make that happen? What management practices do we have to have in place? And then you have to create a model that helps you understand if we created or did this stuff, we would be, in this case, the primary bank. For my former company, we were the home for the world's lists. You got to measure those attributes for that model. Identify points that you're going to focus on and leverage, and then design a bunch of experiments, make some bets, produce those things, measure the impact of those things, and then integrate those learnings back into the loop. I would suggest the reason why people struggle with OKRs is because they do not have a concept or understanding of the persistent model. I agree with John on this point, where you need to understand the persistent model and measurements. Some people would say these would be output measurements, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then you need to be thinking about these point in time goals, these leverage points of focus. And I would argue these point in time goals are where the OKRs fit in. And as opposed to a lot of people's thinking, I agree with Reforge on this. Like I've been thinking for a while, it's not about the one metric that matters, and it's not about the North Star metrics, and about the constellation of metrics that we have to move. Right? We've got to acquire customers. We got to engage them. We've got to convert them. We've got to retain them, potentially expand. If you're in a land expand type of motion and you're working specifically with like big enterprises, you might not sell to the whole thing. You might sell to a part of it if you're a B2B type of environment, right? So the output metrics are really about what is persistent. And the things that we get to work on are inputs that drive that, right? These are the things that are point in time. These are where the OKRs fit in. And you take one part of, let's say, the constellation of metrics, and you're like saying, okay, what we need to figure out, because this is the focus of the business, is we need to figure out how we're going to get more acquisition. Maybe that's the focus for the business. You got to figure out what the model is to drive that. Here's just a simple example of a growth loop and a hook model. Let's say, somebody engages with your product. They took some sort of action. It satisfied their interest. Man, they feel like they're going to get future rewards as a result. There's a trigger that happens, which causes another action. The output is something that is made visible to somebody out in the universe, and a new user was acquired as a result of having seen that output. Like, if you think about TikTok, if you think about Pinterest, you think about any of those models, this is how it happens because someone saw an output. But you see this happen even in SaaS businesses where, let's say you have a Miro or a Notion. Somebody saw the Notion and they were like, oh man, that'd be pretty cool. Got a new user. They created their first notebook. They got a reward. They were able to publish it. It triggered an event that they were like, oh, this is awesome. What if I can share that thing? Someone else saw it and we have that growth loop, right? We need to understand the model. From the model, you can create metrics. From those persistent metrics, you can focus on leverage points. And those are OKRs that you can affect change on. The way to think about that, and I really love Teresa Torres's way to think about it, is you want to start at the top of your tree and insert key result. Like you have an objective, whatever it might be. Our key result is we need to influence acquisition in some way. Like our desired outcome is that X amount of people create Y things in Z time. Cool. There you have a key result. That's what you want to happen. What are the opportunities in your space? What solutions can you gen up that might achieve those things? And how are you going to experiment to figure out which of those would win that you're actually going to invest time, money, people, resources in to build? We start by thinking about the outcome in mind. And by piecing this together and understanding how the whole of the business is trying to operate and our place in it, we're able to now connect the dots between where senior leadership is thinking and where you as a product manager might sit. And so if you were trying to then ask yourself, well, how do we know that we're doing a good job? Well, you would know because you're making progress against your objectives and key results. That's what you've defined as your persistent model. You found your leverage points. You had to find them as outcomes first. You built out a roadmap or a set of capabilities that you want to be able to deliver to your customer. You see if they actually worked or not. And then in aggregate, the business is able to say, oh, this business unit is producing X amount of revenue, X amount of improvements in our asset spend. Maybe it's our operating margins are much more, are much better because we're able to do more or better with, this amount of people because we're leveraging newer technologies, whatever. And whatever that might be ends up being KPI targets that we can point to and say, here are the business units that have strong revenue streams and strong operating margins, because that's what senior leadership cares about. But we are taking care about the experiences for the customer because we're piecing together a story and a journey that matters. And so all of us are winning. Now, you're going to ask yourself, well, Jenny, what's in it for me, right? Well, I offer you this. I know there's a lot of people out there that are probably looking for a new gig or maybe thinking about changing the gig. That's cool. When you are interviewing, they're going to ask you how you had impacted your business. What impact did you have as a product manager at X or Y or Z company? The way to frame that, if you talk to HR leaders, they're going to say, lay out the situation, highlight the task, share how you took the action, and discuss the results. It is not enough to say, well, I shipped 50 features. They're going to say, well, okay, fine. They keep the trains running. But the more powerful story is to say, we realized that X amount of people in this country weren't creating this sort of thing as the first engagement metric in the first run experience. I found that in the data with my team. We highlighted this as an opportunity in the acquisition cycle. We took action. Here are the things that we ended up experimenting with. This is what we ended up building, and it produced this result, would net it out that the business saw an improvement in first run experience and people hitting the aha moment from this to that. People will pay you for that. And this is why I think OKRs matter. And if you're able to think about it in the context of what we discussed today, which is how are you helping provide value, both from a perspective of stakeholder value and what is unique to the business, that strategic value. You are much more poised to be a very powerful PM out there because you're looking at the system, you're understanding point in time where you fit, places of leverage, and how you are materially making impact intentionally and are keeping track of that. With that, I'm going to end here. I know I blitzed through a lot of content, lots of models, but you can hit me up on LinkedIn and check out my podcast where we talk about this stuff all the time on Dreams with Deadlines. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny, for the presentation. Let me share my screen again. All right. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, now you can all ask questions. Indeed, there was a lot of information, a lot of different models. I was taking some notes and I have some questions myself. So yeah, if you have questions, drop them in the chat, wherever you are, on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever, and we'll take them. Before that, and while I give you some time to answer the questions, I will just show a couple more slides about product people so that you can get a better understanding of what we do and also how we use these types of frameworks and a lot of the models Jenny talked about. So some of the use cases, as I was saying in the beginning, we can fill in the role of a interim product manager or product leader. And typically this is for covering like parental leaves or when someone leaves the company in the time that you're still hiring. We can fill in that gap. We can also step in as more product coach or consultant. This can also be on the product ops side, establishing that function. Or if you're a startup, we can also help establish the product function from 0 to 1. And we can also do product discovery work. That's also one of the things that we do, and we use a lot of the frameworks, like for example, the opportunity solution tree is a classical one that we help companies that don't use it implement it better. So that's a little bit more about what we do, what we're not doing. We're not recruiters. We're not a freelance marketplace. So we always go in teams to the clients. It's never just one person allocated. And we're also not a development and design agency. We work with other agencies for that in case it's needed. But typically we get into the company and work with your teams to do the product management work. Here are some of the clients. You probably recognize some of the logos here, and we have like from the smaller startup to bigger companies like the World, or big organizations like the World Health Organization. So we are working with a very varied list of clients, and also some interesting stats about us. We've already supported 120 teams, and internally we have 40 product leaders and product managers, and also 61% of the team are women, which is also a stat that we are very proud of. And here is our team. We still have a free spot there in the corner. So if you want to join our team and help other companies do better products, you can also apply. At the moment, we have we are recruiting for business development, growth and partnerships manager and account executive. We also have the product management position talent pool open, so we are not actively recruiting product managers at the moment, but you can always drop your CV there if it's something that's interesting to you, and we'll get back when the time is more favorable. So that was it, and let's start diving into the questions. We already have quite some questions here. Let's see. I'll start with one here from YouTube from Damien. While OKR systems tell us what we should focus on now, it limits the scope of time that we focus on. OKRs are usually set for a quarter, but what with those groundbreaking changes that make great products? So I guess the question is, the OKRs are usually focused on the time bounded to a specific quarter, for example. How can you make groundbreaking changes to the product?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we have this presupposition that you have to change your OKRs quarterly. There is a form, and if you read any of Christina Wadke's kind of writing, she talks about something called like a milestone key result. The intention being like, you know that something that you need to do is groundbreaking. You just don't know necessarily where you're going to hit in time. And so the idea is that every time you're thinking about hitting that milestone to advance that product, you're moving that metric a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. A great example of that is exactly how they used it at Google. Not that all of us are Google, but like their ambition was to make that what was a Chrome plugin into a browser to be the #1 browser in the world. It took them years to achieve this. And so their key result was really about monthly active users and a certain saturation of the market. And so they moved the proverbial goalpost half year, every year, until they reached an eventuality where I think they're now like 70% of the market. If you ask anybody and you see the usage metrics, it's likely that Chrome's #1, Safari is #2, and then if Opera still exists and Mozilla, the rest of them are kind of the combination of the rest. So don't think that just because you're trying to do something that's groundbreaking, that you can't hold on to your key result or modify it in the way that's pushing the goalpost further. I was just considering it from that perspective. There are different flavors to key results. This just happens to be one. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's quite insightful. Hope that answers, Damien. Let me pick another one here from Zoom, from Chilumba. Thanks, Jenny. Great presentation. Given that startups have a number of tasks to focus, how can a startup use your systems to avoid failure?
Yeah, the first is don't try to do too much. It's amazing if you could limit focus to say, you know what we need to achieve as a business is fill in the blank. In the early stages of Quantive, formerly GTM Hub, we used OKRs and had like the one focus for the whole organization. And then each of our teams had one focus that we lined up to that overall idea. And so that kind of intensity and focus, I think, is what helped us to be able to make up ground, so to speak, in terms of where we were in the market, which is kind of an unknown category at that time. And then a bunch of competitors were in our space. The #1 thing I would say is think people over process, think prioritization over projects. The frame of thinking within the OKR environment are not so much about the letter of the law or the practice. It really is about embodying the spirit, which is, what are we measuring? What points of leverage are we actually going to try to move? How is that going to help the overall business? If you can answer those questions, given the work that you have to do, then you're in a good spot. I'm actually about to release an episode with Luca, and he talks about using OKRs in startups. He's a massive fan of these and has watched many startups use these and then eventually exit as unicorns. And I was like, well, that's awesome. How did they do that? His #1 thing is keep it simple.
Cool. That's a great answer. And we also had another question from LinkedIn, very similar to this, which is the OKR framework for all size companies, especially startups? But maybe can you elaborate? Is it actually applicable to all sizes of companies? So does it also apply to big corporate, from startups, scale-ups, and big corporate?
Yes.
What are the difference in application?
Right. So I think the difference in application, as with building product, is always a question of scale, right? Yes, every business can use them. I'm a firm believer in that. We have used it at every scale of our business, from when I was employee number 19 to now where we're employee 400. And, we're going to continue to use them. We have customers that are like orders of magnitude larger than us. Some of them are nonprofits, even. Some of them are, many of them, for profit. That's any size and scale. The difference really is, what are you solving for? Like, that is what needs to happen when you're thinking about even adopting OKRs to begin with. Why are we doing this? If the answer is so we can be like Google, that's a bad answer. If the answer is because, you know what, we are so big and we've siloed and we need to align, then you're probably going to want to foster alignment and potentially use OKRs to do that, and have shared OKRs as a response to the siloed behavior that you're seeing. I've heard of organizations that will have OKRs for a product and sales function, where the sales team now has key results about installations of a product, and they will get mad because they're trying to sell it and get installations, but they go back to the product team and say, product team, no one is trying to install these things. Why is that happening? You need to do your job so that we can do ours. Forcing alignment. The other could be transparency, because there's a lot of work that's happening, but it's invisible. How do we know that any of that's valuable to the business? We need to surf of these things and start with the outcome focus, as we saw in Teresa Torres' slide. The other could be that, we need, we need people to be outcome focused, because we're all about delivery. And there's certain businesses that are just production shops and they want to break that habit, and having an orientation around outcomes is what they're really seeking, right? And that's changing mindsets and changing behaviors internally to focus on, what does the customer get? What do we get? Rather than how many fill in the blank things did we ship? That change of thinking can be used. So I think it varies from organization to organization and what you're trying to accomplish. Certainly startups can utilize them. Scale-ups as well, and pretty much any flavor of organization, even individuals. I have personal OKRs that I have. Right.
That's very interesting. We have another question here on Zoom from Maru. And disclaimer from Maru, I want to make clear, I love how you linked systemic thinking and strategic thinking with OKRs. And the question is, with regard to systems thinking and intent-based thinking, clients love metrics. How concretely in daily work do you identify the mix of metrics and actions to focus on in the short term, 2 to 4 month cycle, and in the midterm, 12-month cycles?
Okay, so the answer to that, I think, how concretely in daily work do you identify the mix of metrics? I mean, if you're in a Scrum environment, you can even look at sprint goals. I think it varies on the organization, and for sure clients love metrics. The idea is thinking about how plausible is it for you to achieve whatever in a certain time period? How is it possible? And if it's done within a 2 to 4 month cycle, great. Some people do it in 6 months, and you just check in. The idea, though, is to keep your eye on a set of metrics that matter for the delivery teams. You want to be able to even embed these maybe on a half, a half monthly clip, where you're looking at your metrics and saying, well, we shipped whatever, we expected this to happen because we had, affected the first run experience, and acquisition is important. Did we actually see a change in our measurement? If you're able to see that quickly, that's the answer. You want shorter time cycles. That said, the idea is also to nest them. Some of the things that you'll be working on are going to take longer to move, which is why whatever your input metrics, these point in time metrics, how do they relate to these output metrics, those longer time horizons, which might be, related to kind of more persistent measurements for the business. And that's how you can be thinking about them in complement to one another. They fit together. What are your inputs? What are the things that are leading indicators that people talk about that affect the lagging, which are the longer tail things that you want to see adjustments on? That's how they should fit.
Right. That's great insights. One thing about also here on Zoom from Ziad, you mentioned the John Doerr book, the Measure What Matters, and Ziad mentions I came across somewhere that Measure What Matters is outdated, not exemplary. Is that true? And then also, what are some other resources to learn about OKRs? Some other books or other online resources that you'd recommend?
Right. So I wouldn't necessarily say that John Doerr's book is dated, although a lot of people tend to disagree with some of the examples he has in the book. It was the seminal book on OKRs. Some other resources, though, that I would recommend would be Radical Focus by Christina Wadkey. Ben Lamort came out with a book called The OKR Field Guide. That's if you're trying to actually do this and you want to know the practices, how to define things, what the cycle should look like, what an OKR champion does, he wrote the book on how to actually do this. So Ben Lamort would be another great resource. If you're in Italy, Antonio Civita wrote a book about OKRs. There are a few others that I can think of, which I can send to you. My podcast, we talk about it all the time, how people are doing this in practice, and certainly Quantive's website. Like we have a free online course that you can even take, and it'll be sent to you via email. Like you'll have like lessons that you can read in chunks. So all kinds of places that you can look, but those are kind of the ones that come to mind.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And also, I'd suggest connecting or following Jenny on LinkedIn. I've been following, and it's a good source of inspiration.
Thank you.
We have another question here from LinkedIn from Nina. Are OKRs always shared between the business and product team? When wouldn't or shouldn't they be? Can you provide some examples?
Again, I feel like a broken record. It depends. Like, what are you trying to solve for with your OKRs? At the end of the day, what the product team does is in service of the more persistent metrics. If we're doing whatever we're doing, will this help us monetize? Will this help us convert? Will this help us retain customers? Will this help us acquire customers? That's the business side of things, right? The things that we're trying to do is behavioral. Like we are centered around jobs to be done, if you want to use that framework to be thinking about that. Someone hired us to do something. Are we doing that thing? And if we're not, they're going to fire us and find someone else that does, or resort to, behaviors that they did prior to finding our solution, right? And so to the extent that we can, we need to understand, again, the persistent models that exist. How do we actually measure what is in that persistent model at that highest level, the output metrics? And then what are we going to do in service? So that's the alignment component of that. There might be instances, for example, where you might, like I'm in SaaS, and customer success and product might have a shared key result, because customer retention is not only the job of the product, it is just as much the job of customer success and the experience at the touch points if they're a managed account. So there might be a key result that they want to share. And it could be like improving a customer health score, for example, because each part has a contribution to customer health. Are they using the product? Are they trained, educated on the product? Is it being rolled out to the organization correctly? Mm-hmm. What do the measurements look like when they're checking in with us at the QBR? Like that's an example of where that intersection can exist. And so business counterparts, product counterparts, there are all kinds of places where we can find jointly how we can better an experience for our customers that still support also the needs of the business, which in the case of us is if our customer health scores are up, they will likely be retained, and we could possibly see expansion opportunities or upsell opportunities, even should we have more products and services that appeal to them. So you can see how this kind of channels even into the sales team's key results as well.
Yep, right. We still have here one question from YouTube, but by the way, as a side note, everyone watching us, you can drop your questions in the comment section and we'll take them. We still have some time, I think, to take some more questions. Before we get to this question we have here from Damien, you were mentioning just in your previous answer about the persistent model, something that John Cutler also talks about. How do you, first, can you expand a little bit on that for people who are not familiar with it? And also, how can you identify or define it in your specific product, in your situation?
How to define what? Sorry, one more time.
How to understand the persistent model that you have in your specific case.
Oh goodness. I mean, that's an entire talk on its own.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know.
Okay. Where to begin?
Yeah, like where do you even begin with figuring out a persistent model? Like the first, I mean, he provides a really good framework actually as prompts to be thinking about. And the starting point is typically like, who is your customer? What are they trying to achieve? What do you provide a service for that provides an answer to that need? And then there's a combination of questions about your offering, who it is that you're doing that for, what behaviors that they're encountering that help you figure out how those behaviors map together. An example I can use is the Wunderlist one, right? We knew that we wanted to be the home of the world's list. We created a to-do list app. That's amazing. Our customer was pretty much anybody who wanted to keep their life together, and they were on mobile devices because we were all about keeping their life in sync. So we always cared about like multi-device kind of experiences. You had it on the web app, you had it on a mobile device, maybe you had an iPad. Cool. And so if I'm thinking about persistent model for us in terms of acquisition, let's say, what we wanted to be able to figure out was, all right, how do we create that loop, right? That people would know that we're a thing. There are a few ways to do that. One was, well, they can get to know us via the App Store, but you can't necessarily game that per se. That's really hard. But the other thing was, we were thinking, why don't we create something called public lists? Because if you created a list and it became public, someone else would be able to see that, right? And so for us, acquisition could look like, you know, X customer created a task, but also a public list within a certain amount of time. Because if you did it within, let's say, the first 30 days and you shared your bucket list on your blog, someone else is going to read that blog and they're going to say, oh, what's that thing? Click on it, get redirected back to the Wunderlist site, and we have a model. So that is a form of acquisition that we could do. But again, we needed to think about who we were serving, which are people who want to create lists. We were thinking about what we offered, what we could offer, which in this case was, let's make it so that they can actually publish this stuff. And then they can easily embed that wherever it is that they wanted, whether it was in social media. In this case, it could have been like a blog that they had kept for themselves, but it was a means for somebody to have an awareness that we were even an option. They're like, oh, what's that? And so all of a sudden we have a concept of what a persistent model could look like for acquisition, specifically the output part of that for someone else to be able to find us. And so this is going to be nuanced for each organization. Like, you got to think, who is this for? What are we doing? What could be? And how are we going to measure that behavior to say, if we did this, this is what the result action would be in terms of acquisition in this case, or conversion events. And there's going to be a certain level of activity that happens that cause someone to be sticky, for example. What are those attributes? We're all ending up putting like economist hats on. And that's the challenge, is to figure out, what is the forcing function or the success function to arrive at this outcome?
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah. That's very insightful. I mean, for me personally, it's still relatively new concept, so it helped a lot to clarify, and I guess for other people as well. Let me ask you here one question from Damien, that's watching us on YouTube. What's the trick to set OKRs in a way that it won't promote competition between teams in the same organization? So maybe some specific tactics to avoid competing OKRs.
So this is where strategic thinking is at its finest, right? You need to have what I like to call white space to be able to interact with other teams to talk about alignment. Some businesses formalize this event. If you talk to anybody from Personio, you can talk to Michaela. She's one of the OKR champions there. They have an OKR fair. If you remember from your days in school where you had a science fair and you showed everybody your booth and what you had learned and your research and the outcomes of the stuff that you did, they do this with OKRs. They set their OKRs, they present that in right now a virtual environment because their team is highly distributed. And everybody is able to go to each team and be like, where are we connected? Where are we conflicted? And to negotiate what needs to happen as a result. Now, here's where it gets really exciting, is that there needs to be incentives, I think, in organizations as well. Lean Plum does this in a wonderful way, where at the end of each period, they showcase out of the group of their peers who did the best. And they also got like a monetary kick as a bonus, for example, for being recognized by a group of their peers. And so even from a business perspective, there's an incorporation of incentivization for people to work well together because they want to champion other people's successes. And here's the thing about businesses, and I remember learning this from a mentor a long time ago. I can do one thing well by myself. You get a group of people, you can do immeasurably more. Presumably you have a department of people or teams of teams, you can do even more, which is why enterprises are so powerful. You put all those brains together, we can do some really awesome stuff. And it is to our benefit then to try to figure out ways where we don't conflict and where we can combine efforts or combine ideas in terms of what we want to achieve. Because at the end of the day, imagine the example that I gave, we want installations of our product in this business or our customer businesses. You have a sales team that's highly incentivized to do that. You have a product team that's now incentivized to do that. They go in together and say, sales team's got to sell it, but they're coming back with objections. And they're telling the product team like, well, these are the things that customers or prospects are saying that aren't all that great. You need to take this back into your feedback loops and figure out what you're going to do as a response to that. Product's going to gen up, based on the opportunity tree that you saw Teresa Torres kind of put together to experiment with ideas. They come back, they put this to the sales team to go out and sell. And hopefully they're inching their way toward, here's how we can get capture and here's how we can get conversion, and product and sales work together in a beautiful way. But it required them to be able to have time to talk to each other. And I don't think businesses allow for this necessarily in a formal way. And if that's not happening, that's something that you can bring up. Again, strategic thinking for the win with your senior leadership to say, hey, I feel like we need more time for us to be able to talk between teams about what other teams are trying to achieve so that we can figure out amongst ourselves how we can align.
Right. Cool. Thanks so much. There's a lot of people thanking in all the platforms for the talk. I think it was very insightful, at least for me it was. Before we wrap up, just one question more relating to your career, which is quite interesting. You didn't get into a lot of details, but people could see that you come from a lot of different, you have a lot of different experiences. What are some recommendations that you have to someone that wants to break into product management?
Breaking into product management for me was accidental. So I feel like I'm not a good necessarily example for that. What I got really good at in the beginning was the data or measurement aspect of this. I actually started on the finance side of things and eventually learned how to write an SQL query. I got access to our databases and could ask questions of the database because I had them. And then eventually, and I was part of a startup at the time, and eventually they were like, Jenny, I can't believe you learned this stuff. And I was like, yeah, right. And I created some dashboards and some presentations that eventually surfaced and then got to the board level where people were looking at the measurements and they were like, oh, I didn't know that about our customer base or the distribution of our user base or the activities that there were. I didn't know at the time that this was going to be super valuable. I mean, I did, but I didn't. And I kind of backed my way into it by understanding the measurement. So if there's any way to start as a PM, figure out how you can think through measurements, metrics,
Right.
what is affecting people. Like, you built these things, cool. What are people doing with those things? Are they doing those things together with certain other capabilities and functionalities? Where do those connect? And you might not need to do that, but you definitely should like be best friends with the data team or somebody who can, and start asking them questions, because you get good at that. Then you can start cracking well, this is where we are now. If we did these things and try to achieve that outcome, we think we're going to change these measures. Powerful combination. The other part is, be highly empathetic, like be willing to go out there and talk to a bunch of people. In the early days, I was doing a lot of guerrilla kind of like investigation, because we didn't have a user research team. So I just went out and asked people to try stuff. Like, I was really scrappy. As I matured, I started to realize that there are technologies that will do this. So the folks that can understand the customer the best, figure out what the business is trying to accomplish, has their hand on the metrics, and really can understand the job. Like, what are they hiring you to do and what could they hire you to do? Those are the best kind of product people I found, because that's the language they speak.
Right. That's super cool advice. You're saying that you don't have any advice. That's a great piece of advice.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much. And also thanks to everyone that was following the talk on all the different platforms. Don't forget to join us for our next event, and also connect on LinkedIn, on all the other platforms, and check our new podcast that was launched just today. That can be a cool thing. And also Jenny's podcast. That's also,
and hit me up on LinkedIn. Would love to hear from you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Bye, everybody.